Want to be in the know on all things cannabis? You're in the right place. Regulations, growing, running the business. I need $1. Welcome to the $1 Pound Podcast. Here are your hosts, industry professionals, Ryan and Joey.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the $1 Pound Podcast. My name's Joey. You're here with Ryan as well, my partner. And we decided to kind of start these off a little bit different than we normally do. Before we hop in with the guest that we have today, we wanted to go over at the beginning of the show what the average price of cannabis is, because we are the $1 pound, and we do predict the price will eventually go down. Maybe not $1, but we think it's going to go down over time. And something that recently has been introduced by budtrader.com is the average price on their website for the different states that they basically work with. Budtrader.com is a website that people can use to basically buy and sell cannabis. It's been around for a very long time. I've personally used it for myself in the past, and currently if you go to their california.budtrader.com, you can see that the average price of a pound in California, according to their data, is at $1,268, which is just something interesting to keep track of and see where this price is going to go, how it fluctuates, and what part of the year it fluctuates at. Another common tool that we like to use is cannabisbenchmarks.com, which is a great tool to use if you're trying to keep track of the wholesale data on cannabis in the market. And they have a free weekly report that releases the U.S. Cannabis Spot Index. And if you subscribe to their service, you can get much more detailed information on what indoor is going for, what greenhouse is going for, and of course outdoor is going for in the various states. So their latest report from December 8th is that the U.S. Cannabis Spot Index is up 5.1% to $1,442 per pound. So keep in mind the U.S. spot for their data is usually pretty close to California, considering California is really the most volume of what's going out there. So you can pretty much wager that we're looking anywhere from $1,200 to $1,400 on average for cannabis in California at the moment. Moving on from the price of cannabis, we wanted to just talk about the latest cannabis news that's happening in California. Obviously, the biggest thing that's going on are the regulations. While we're at the Marijuana Business Conference in Las Vegas, the state departments released their emergency regulations on November 16th, 2017, which outlined the newest sets of regulations and rules for commercial cannabis in the state. So that's basically what all of us has been waiting for. All of us compliance geeks have been waiting to basically read all of these regulations that have come out. And a lot of people that were actually in Vegas weren't necessarily partying too much. They were actually opening up regulations and legislation and reading things, which is kind of wild. So that's kind of the perfect segue to lead into our guest that we have today. We really have the perfect guest to discuss all these types of changes taking place in California and throughout the country. It's a pleasure to welcome Amanda Ostrowitz, I got that correct, who is the co-founder of CannaRegs.com. Amanda, thank you so much for coming today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And I appreciate you taking the time. I know you're busy, bouncing all over the place. I see your Facebook feed, and it seems like every other week there's another map about you flying here or flying there or something crazy.
How else would you know I was coming to Monterey?
Right? Yeah, so I definitely appreciate you taking the time with us. To start it off, I mean, pretty basic stuff. We want to know kind of who you are, what's your background, and we talked about it earlier, kind of how you got into this cannabis mess.
Well, so I'm Amanda. I'm the founder of CannaRegs. I'm actually an attorney by trade, attorney turned entrepreneur. I don't know if it's a recovering attorney or did I become crazier in becoming an entrepreneur, to be determined. But prior to cannabis regulatory, I was in banking regulatory. Surprisingly, I was actually at the Federal Reserve Bank last as a regulator. But that was back in 2014 now. But while I was there were all these problems with banking, and I started to do some research into some of the banking issues. And when I did that banking research, you go further and further down the rabbit hole, and you get into some city-level laws. And I started to notice very quickly that each city had completely different laws. It was different agencies within each city that were regulating the industry, and they weren't easy to find. They were changing all the time, and there was no one place for all this information. And granted, my studies in this had begun based on the banking issues. Quickly realized that I myself was not going to be the one to solve the banking problem, but I had found this information problem during all my research and decided I was going to try to solve that. And that's how CannaRegs was born. We've been that was back, in 2014. We've been building ever since, always adding new products and features and jurisdictions. We launched in the Colorado market. We also added a couple after that, and then we came into California in March of 2016. And we've been growing very quickly ever since, especially in the last 7-8 months, even faster. And California now gets about 95% of our attention. That's really where my staff is still in Colorado, but they're California experts.
Yeah, I mean, California is a beast, right? It's
539 local jurisdictions that all want to do it their own way. A state, where in other states, one main agency would oversee all the licensees. Here, they divided that into 3 and then statutorily involved more than another dozen. California's complex. It keeps us busy. Hopefully, we make it a lot more simple for everyone else to follow.
Yeah, and California is the 6th largest economy in the world, I believe. That just recently, is it 5th or 6th? One of the two.
6, I think 6th.
And the population, I think, is around 4 million more than Canada. So we are definitely a whole nother beast when it comes to regulation and all this type of stuff going on. But what I want to talk about before we get into regulations more is the banking. I mean, you coming from a banking background is certainly interesting, and you know better than most of us how complex banking is for cannabis. I mean, do you see what would it take for a solution, or is there going to be a solution, or what's your prediction?
It would take a change of federal law. I mean, either cannabis needs to be removed from the Controlled Substances Act or some other piece of legislation that would allow these banks to do this without violating federal law. There's a ton of workarounds right now, but they're really not solutions. The solution would be the law changing at a federal level. And so the question is how is that going to come about? I'd like to think that the IRS might be the ones to push that change because, well, they really like collecting taxes, and it's really hard to collect taxes from people without banks. Mm-hmm. I think they could be one of the ones that really make that push, but I think it's going to take the right administration being in office. I don't think it's this one, but if it happened, I wouldn't complain.
Yeah, and so you're in Colorado. So what do they do in Colorado right now for banking? Anything at all?
Yeah, and I am based in Colorado, but I'm actually here way more than I'm in Colorado now. But everyone for the most part has some form of banking. There aren't that many businesses just dealing in cash. But what happens is there are banks willing to bank it. There's just not enough, and they have to do it under the guise of the FinCEN guidelines. And the FinCEN guidelines have a lot of compliance burdens. Whenever I lecture on the FinCEN guidelines, I actually go through all the steps simply to make the point that even talking through all of them is a lot, let alone dealing with them. So the banks who are incentivized to do this are generally small banks who can charge significant amounts for these accounts, not just like a regular bank. So most banks make their money on loans and on fees. But fees are usually 10% of how a bank makes money. When it comes to these banks with these cannabis accounts and charging heavy monthly fees to be there, they're actually making a lot more revenue from that than they could on any other account. That said, there's a lot of risk for them. They don't want to lose their insurance. They don't want to end up in trouble with the Fed. So it's got to be profitable enough for it to make sense. And that usually leads to only it making sense for small banks because they have enough to gain. Whereas a big Wells Fargo, a Chase, a Bank of America, the amount they could profit even from charging $3,000 a month for an account is not enough. So it's these smaller banks, and they try to keep it to a limited number of customers because they don't want it to be a large part of their portfolio. That's not just an issue of risk. That's just banking as a whole. You have to have a diversity in the portfolio of the people that you bank. Imagine if your bank only took people who worked in construction, and then you have an economic meltdown, right? And the construction industry goes a bust, and now the bank's going to be in trouble. And that's because it wasn't diverse enough. And so in the same sense, they can't have that many customers being cannabis customers either, just from a safety and soundness perspective as a bank. So it lends you to these small banks, but then they kind of hit their capacity of how many of these customers they can fit in their portfolio comfortably. And there's kind of an unspoken rule of 10%. So there are several banks out there in Colorado doing this, but they've kind of hit their max. And I know we were talking earlier, kind of, it sounds like similar things have happened out here as well.
Yeah, definitely. So I mean, that's probably what we're going to see in California, right? Just maybe random credit unions willing to do a little bit here and there, and that's going to be the only way.
Absolutely, and they might not be close by. I do know of several companies in Colorado who have to do, a weekly drive of the cash out to the bank that's 2 hours away.
Wow, that's a huge security risk.
Not ideal. No, all of it's dangerous, extremely dangerous, but at least there's some banks, right? And,
Right.
We, as a company that sells software to the industry, they all are able to pay us with a check or a credit card. So I think we've only ever once had one really try to pay in cash, and we don't take cash. We made them go get a money order.
Right.
That's our deal with our bank. You'd be amazed, though. Even for us to get a bank was kind of hard, and we're just a legal research tool. We don't touch the plant at all, but because we have customers that are in cannabis, it was challenging. And thankfully, having come from the banking world, I had a few connections, and the right introduction got us a bank account. And we have a great relationship with our bank. We're very honest about what we do. I can't really pretend that I wouldn't know better about, the know your customer laws or whatnot, considering my background. So I had to do it the honest way. But it also has made things challenging when it comes to getting merchant services and things like that, because I'm going to tell the merchant service provider exactly what I do.
Right. And the one thing that Ryan and I have talked about a few times is, like in Monterey County, for example, there's a lot of people self-reporting their taxes and they're paying in cash, whereas the county depositing the money. Like they have their own bank account that accepts that money, I guess, and that's okay. Or I don't know. I've always kind of wondered how that works. I mean,
they're the government,
right? I know that part.
Well, and I mean, that's why everyone's turning to the state of California for the banking solution, because what are you going to do? Feds, are you going to come after the state of California?
Right.
Really? Like, do you want to pick that fight?
Right.
But they're one of the few that's big enough to stand up to it.
Yeah.
If they're going to be the clearinghouse for the cash.
Yeah. So.
But I mean, the IRS does take the cash. They always figure out a way. I mean, there are people that show up for their tax appointments with the IRS guy, and they used to charge a fee for paying in cash. It was a 10% penalty, and it was absurd because there were these businesses that are, unfortunately, cash-only businesses, and they're paying their taxes on time, trying to, and wasting their own time having to go through this count, and yet they're penalized for paying their taxes in full on time because they did it in cash.
Right.
You're like, what more? So the law got changed there, actually. A couple of years ago, Rachel Gillette represented All Greens in a case against the IRS for about this penalty, and they won. And they put out guidance and changed it so that unbanked taxpayers who could show adequate efforts to have gotten a bank and failed to be able to get a bank for whatever reason don't face the 10% penalty. And then the state of Colorado followed suit and adopted a similar law for unbanked taxpayers.
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, this industry is so crazy how we can't bank, but we still have to pay our taxes, and then penalties for actually paying your taxes. And the only way you can pay them, it's just everything you do in this business, there's a challenge. So. And
then driving down to Denver with a duffel, there's these companies that were like up, in Telluride or Aspen that have to drive down to Denver with duffel bags of cash to go meet the IRS. It's craziness.
Yeah, that is pretty crazy.
That's why I say the IRS could be one of the people that push for the change, because they like to collect money, and it's much easier to collect it when it's on the wire. It's also much easier to track if people are actually paying their taxes based on what they're earning if it's all on the wire.
Right.
But since these people aren't taking credit cards or doing normal deposits into a bank, there's nothing to compare against.
When you say that the IRS theoretically could be the ones that would actually push for it, how would they actually do that? Would they do that as some kind of a congressional law? Would they just lobby? Would they just suddenly say we now accept it?
I think there'd be many different routes. It wouldn't be a suddenly we just accept it, but that's for them to figure out. They want the money, they'll figure it out. I'm very glad not to be a lawmaker. But it would definitely be a change in law. I just think they'd probably be one of the supporters that would be, pushing for the federal law change. Or ought to, but then again, it's the IRS. They're pretty conservative.
I'm curious. I know you come out to California almost all the time now, but what similarities or differences have you seen with how Colorado rolled out their rules and regulations to what California is currently going through?
There's very little that's similar, other than a lot of people not knowing what they're about to face. I mean, the big difference is in Colorado, they already had stood up their oversight bodies and they already had medical going in a big way. So there were dispensaries and all of these things in existence and all the different license types just on the medical side only. So when they came on for recreational, yes, the laws changed and there was a lot of change. But it wasn't out of the blue, hey, we're going to stand up medical and recreational all at once. So this is much more challenging. Also, in Colorado and most every other state, there's one main agency that's the oversight for the licensees. And here in California, in the California way, they had to divide it out into 3 agencies. That's the 3 primary agencies. And then there's more than, a couple dozen more that are involved by statute. So, you've got your water boards and your pesticide regulation and fish and wildlife and highway patrol, and it goes on and on and on. And so, there are a few agencies in these other states that are concurrently involved, but not nearly in the same capacity that they are here. I mean, California makes everything harder. That's just how it works. And I think what's interesting too is that, a lot of people, I mean, it's hard to watch in some ways because having seen the rollout in other states, you see that the people who are some of the people you think could never be dethroned and could never fail, they're long gone. And I say when I'm in a room with 5 licensees, I'm like, look at each other, right? You guys think you're all great. You all believe in each other or don't, whatever. You guys might be the 3 strongest brands anyone's heard of, and at least 2 of you are going to be gone in a year. And that's just the reality that people don't feel yet. And it's a painful one. But that's why people got to get serious. And it's time. And, it's different regionally around California as to how people are preparing for it. But a lot don't even have their local ordinances done. So it's going to be an interesting year. 2018, man. It's going to be a very interesting one. I think 2019 will be too. It's going to be a few years before there's any certainty in this.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, out of all the states that you've actually seen, and considering, I mean, this is just going to keep happening, rolling east as more states turn on into the center and the south. If there was a perfect way to do this, not that there is, but if you had to mix and match from what different states had done and learning by it, like California is probably a little bit too insane and intense of how we're doing this, and there's too many different departments talking to each other. Out of all the models you've seen so far, what state do you think did it almost the best?
That's tough, man. Asking the hard questions already.
You got to mix and match it somehow to make this Frankenstein work in another place.
That's why I don't work as a regulator anymore. I don't have to. It's the best part of my job. I just have to tell people what the law is today.
Yeah, but sitting back and critiquing, you got to have some opinions at this point of how it could work better.
I genuinely don't sit back and critique. That's the fun part. I keep up with what's happening and I get to analyze but to not completely dodge the question, I think Nevada's been moving pretty swiftly. Their ability to turn on recreational well before their deadline was quite impressive. And of course, they've had some supply chain issues. But, they are seeming to work pretty well, but they took a while to really ramp up. Colorado is working pretty effectively. It's not perfect. I definitely wouldn't follow Florida's lead. They've been a disaster. But who knows, maybe one day they'll actually serve the patients there. There's so much to figure out still. There's still not enough data to know who's doing it well or not. It'll be interesting to see. I really don't like the states though that are doing this. Let's start small and see how it works. And then if it's working, we'll go bigger. And the problem is that if they don't create a big enough ecosystem early on, it doesn't, 1, destigmatize it, and 2, patients really won't go that far away from home. So, think about it. If you have to drive 40 minutes for something and they recommend to you a strain, we don't have the kind of data for them to say, okay, you've got Parkinson's and here's the strain for you. That's not there yet because we don't have real science. So let's say I have Parkinson's and I take this 45-minute haul out to the dispensary and what you give me doesn't really work for me. Right? Well, the doctor has much higher probability with a pharmaceutical often of knowing how it's going to affect. And guess what? If it doesn't work, they call you in another prescription and you go 5 minutes to CVS. And I think by creating these programs that are small, it's such a task for someone to get to the dispensary that they don't go back again and try again and again. And in places like even in Connecticut, there's 9 dispensaries, I think, or actually might have increased to 12 now. It's still a half an hour for most people to go there. And it's just that going back and forth to really learn these things is challenging. But if it's down the street, just as convenient as your Walgreens or your CVS, people are going to give it more shots to figure out what works for them. And so these small systems, they're starting right now and they're going, well, we don't have that many patients, so why would we allow more dispensaries in? And part of why they're not getting the patients is because there aren't enough success stories. And part of it is the distance and the normalizing of it. So these start small and see how it goes, I think, is inhibiting the total number of patients and people's willingness to really continue to experiment to find their medicine.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And those ones, none of them have gone, oh, this is great, let's go bigger. None of them have. And I think free market on that is dictating a lot more. I mean, in Colorado, there's a lot of dispensaries. Even just in Denver, there's more dispensaries than there are Starbucks and McDonald's combined. And they're still in business, and there's a reason why. And, you might think, oh, I might need to go get something. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. But if it's just a 1-block walk, you're going to go so much more often.
Oh my God, there's that many dispensaries there, you say? What the hell are we doing here, Joey? We fucked this all up. Okay, well, hold on.
Who's to say they're the perfect model? But they're certainly killing it in sales.
How's the government been as far as going after large operators in that area to begin with?
And in what sense? Going after like legal or illegal?
Legal. Are they pretty lenient?
Oh, no, they regulate hard, and a bunch have gone out of business or gotten violations where they had to surrender their license or sell their license. So it used to be that when people got in trouble, they would then sell their license because they knew they were going to otherwise get it revoked. So the state actually had to make a law that says you can't sell a license that's subject to discipline because, you got in trouble and now you just sold your company off at a profit. So that one doesn't work as well anymore. But there are big groups out there that buy up these ones that are distressed. And then they just keep growing larger. And so I think they've regulated even-handedly, but hard. And they regulate at the state level regularly and at the city level. And it seems to work. People pay a lot of fines every year. They put out the list of the fines and fees paid, and people pay them because they want to stay in business. But it's definitely a highly regulated industry, and it's legitimately done, and it's working.
We were talking at lunch a little bit about the actual on-site public consumption. There was a bill that initiative that almost got pushed there in the city of Denver, was it, to allow it for dispensaries, but they got shut down by state, and then they got it passed through by restaurants and bars somehow? Could you explain
what
why?
happened? So this initiative passed. So there was an initiative in Denver. It was Initiative 300, and it was to allow social consumption. And when it was passed, the concept was that they wanted people to be able to have consumption sites because they'd created this ecosystem that brought in a lot of tourists too, where you could buy cannabis. It was legal to consume it, but there was nowhere for anyone to consume. The only place to consume it legally, because you're not allowed to consume in public, was in one's own home. Well, if you're a tourist, what are you going to do? You can't go to your hotel and smoke. So, I mean, edibles was an easier option, but it really didn't it left this gap in the system, right? You could buy it, but you had nowhere to consume. And so they wanted to close that off. And so they wanted to create the ability not just for there to be, a smoking lounge that's just like being in your home with couches, but also the ability for people who wanted to consume and those who didn't to interact together. So the idea of coffee shop where you could consume, or a yoga studio that was consumption friendly, or even a place, a designated area at a bar where you and your friends who are out and one prefers consuming cannabis over alcohol could consume and everyone could be out and together. So that was the goal of it. Well, it passed, and much to the begrudge of the alcohol industry, they thought if people were able to consume cannabis at those places, they would drink less. And so the alcohol industry pushed at the state level, even though this was a Denver law, and asked and got the state to pass a law that says anybody who has a liquor license is not allowed to have one of these social consumption licenses from Denver. And so knocks out the ability for people to, have that shared experience, but it doesn't completely knock out the ability to have the coffee shop or the yoga studio or the lounge. So that could still move forward. But then under this ballot initiative, the city still had to write the regulations governing it. And that's where things got messy. A lot of the original intent was never met. The compliance burdens were extreme and costly and highly prohibitive in many ways. All the steps they put in basically made it nearly impossible, such that they've been done and applications have been available for over 4 months, and they just this week got their very first application in. And that doesn't really happen, when something is feasible. And we don't know if this first one will even get approved. It will be interesting. But, everyone who really fought for that has been very disappointed. So it looks like, maybe this one will go through, maybe not. I'm not sure. There's definitely speculation on the qualifications of this candidate. But it doesn't seem like Denver's going to be the ones paving the way for social consumption. It looks far more likely that it's going to be either a California city or Las Vegas. I mean, it fits the Las Vegas profile much better.
Totally.
And they're definitely more open-minded in general when it comes to adult activities like drinking and gambling and prostitutes. All those types of things that would make them more open. But there's a lot of cities in California that we're tracking really closely that are also having this conversation in a serious and meaningful way, that are also places that are far more open-minded than Denver as a whole.
Yeah, so one thing I wanted to ask you, that's, I guess, off topic from consumption, but taxes. I mean,
2018, year of the tax crisis in California.
Right? What do you think about like Colorado's taxes? Or do you think they have it right? Are they still too high?
Colorado's taxes are high, but they're manageable, and people have gotten by. But they're way, way, way lower than anything in California. So in Denver, like if you go in a store and purchase retail cannabis, the effective tax rate is 21.15%. And so that's your normal Denver sales tax would have been about 7. Well, I have the whole breakdown somewhere, but the long story short is cannabis is only a small part of that. It's 10% at the state level and 3.5%, I think, at the Denver level. And it all comes out to 21.15. And that's also being charged to the consumer. It's not being built in. It's a sales tax. Mm-hmm. So California, there's all these gross receipts taxes. So those are built into the price of the cannabis. I mean, and the total numbers are staggeringly higher. I mean, the states already started at a higher level, but the locals, see, it's also different. Remember, in Colorado, the state regulated first, and then the cities could create more restrictive laws. California legalized way before Colorado, back in 1996, and they said, cool, it's allowed. Local governments, you figure out how to do it. And so locals have been the only ones that were taking anything until, January of this year, right? So the local had the ability to put a higher tax in back then, and it could have been something that was manageable because there was no state marijuana tax on top of it. And they really looked at it in a lot of places as a answer to economic problems, as a revenue generator. And now you pull into this the state's taxes and you add in all the state compliance burdens, and it's just going to be prohibitively expensive. There's no way, there's very few places, that have it right. I was in a Northern California county, I won't say which, not too long ago, and one of the planning director asked me, he goes, don't you think our taxes are too low? I said, no, you'll be one of like 5 in 2018 that doesn't have to lower theirs. You got it right the first try. Just stick with it. But, they all like to herd mentality. And so one government says, oh, well, so-and-so did 10% gross receipts. We can too. I mean, they must have had some logic to it. And then it's like, well, everyone's logic is because the other guy did it. Right. Or because one consulting firm said it was fine. Or one consulting firm based it off what they thought prices were 3 years ago versus what they are now. especially with these taxes that are a fixed price per square foot. I mean, that's entirely different. It's not even based on how much somebody is selling or how much they're producing. A production-based tax, much more like the excise tax at the state level, makes more sense, but the locals aren't doing those same style of excise taxes. So I joke that when we were tracking Colorado, we were able to build these tax calculators. They were really simple. We'd break down all the local taxes that were cannabis specific and non, and we'd come up with a number. And we could plug any city or county into that formula because there was excise and sales. In California, we can't make a calculator because we'd have to make a brand new one for every single city and county. They all do it their own way, and it's always different. And there's just different tiers. It'll be like up to $10 a square foot for the first 5,000 square feet, up to 20 for the next, and then in the next town, it's 10% gross receipts for for-profit companies and 5% for nonprofits, and then this many dollars per 1,000. I mean, it's everywhere is so different. So we aggregate them all into one chart, but we couldn't even create calculators because California all wants to do it its own way. And so I think a lot of these local governments don't even realistically know what effective rates they just placed on these businesses. And I don't think a lot of these businesses understand right yet what hardship they're going to face in these taxes. They're going to get hit in such a hard way in 2018 that they're not prepared for. People were just scrambling to find anywhere they could place a business in a local government that would allow it, and forgot some of these other factors.
Yeah.
And it's going to be scary to see.
And one thing that was interesting about the way California did it was they did 15 for retailers anyway. They did 15% of the average market price, not 15% of what actually gets sold at that specific dispensary.
And that's interesting. I actually don't object to average market rate. I think it's worked really well in Colorado, and the idea being, it's going to be really, really, really challenging to calculate it if it's based on everything you do. And they want the excise tax to be paid at the time of transfer. So it's not based on what it's, if you are vertically integrated and you send it from your cultivation to your storefront, and then you have to wait and see what each eighth sells for in each gram, it'd be too complex. It would add too many layers of calculation. So at the one time when it transfers from cultivation in California to distributor, in Colorado, it happens when it goes from cultivation to either the manufacturer or the dispensary. At least there's a set bar as to what the price is. And it's, in Colorado, they set it every 6 months. I assume it'll be similar here. Mm-hmm. And it works. It's one that's actually a way of making it less complicated.
Interesting. So, and in Colorado, you guys don't have distributors, right? That's
Nope.
not a license type.
It sure isn't.
So that's the whole another factor to this that California's kind of freaking out about, especially here in our county, because they're taxing every single part of the supply chain locally.
Absolutely. And it's going to be a big challenge because there aren't enough distributors up and running yet anyway. I mean, the distributorship is going to be very interesting to watch unfold. There are a few things I like about it. I think it will be helpful to some of the small brands who wouldn't otherwise have the ability to have strong distribution. I think it's good that the cultivator isn't the one sampling their own product for the testing facilities. I mean, that's a big, hoorah for public safety in that sense. Because, I mean, people are definitely taking the cleanest sample they can, and sending that off, or the strongest sample for potency testing, But it is going to be crazy. And I'm very confident that not only will the actual regulations that come into play after the emergency regulations, right? Everyone's freaking out right now. These are just emergency regs. We're going to actually go through a proper notice and comment rulemaking in 2018. But even when that's done, the laws are going to change again after that continuously. And I think we'll see a lot of refinement in the next 4 years continuously on the distributor model because it's never been done. They can't borrow from anyone else. Granted, Nevada has, but Nevada's brand new at it. And it's a very different distributor model than the one that's here. So I think, even in Colorado, there was just, few hundred pages of new regulations put out about 4 weeks ago, 3-4 weeks ago, that go into effect in January, and several more that were in that batch that will go into effect in July. And so we're how many years down the line in Colorado, and still hundreds of pages of changes. California, it's going to be more extreme than that. And there's a ways to go. So that's the thing that a lot of people are struggling with too, trying to figure everything out. And there's sometimes where you have to tell them, if it makes absolutely no sense, if you truly like can't get through it and it makes no sense, it will probably change.
Right.
It's not the end of the world, but it's going to take time and patience. And, I've been telling people for the last year, and if people are like, okay, if you could give one piece of advice, what would it be? I say, if you're profitable right now, make sure you're putting away at least half of your money, because it's not for when you might need it. It's you will need it.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I know plenty
not
of
time
people.
to buy a new car.
Yeah. We know plenty of people that are already undercapitalized now. They started with a good chunk of change and
They buy a lot of stupid toys along the way, too. Unbelievable.
yeah. And then speaking of tax too, something that came out recently from California was they've gotten smarter to how the industry works, and they are now placing a tax on basically fresh frozen fresh cannabis. I think it's $1.29 per ounce. Works out to like $20 and some change per pound.
Yeah, and they definitely, I think, took a book out of Colorado, because Colorado was having an issue with the excise tax with fresh frozen, because obviously it's much heavier, right? It's still wet, it's not dried, and the excise tax was universal across all plants. Well, they broke out trim separately. It was just whole plant, trim, and clones. And they added a new category into their average market rate for fresh frozen, because of how waterlogged it still is at that point. So I know it sounds, at first you're like, oh, why is that differentiated? But it is a good thing that it's differentiated, because if they kept it universal, it'd be extremely expensive. And it should be, taxed just like the rest. Just has to be at a different price per pound.
One thing I wanted to bring up too, I don't know if you guys have seen this. It's an article that came out recently. I found it on Newsweek about Canada and what they're proposing to do with their cannabis. Have you read about this and the price fixing?
Yeah.
Or like they're setting the price, I guess you should say.
Tell me about it.
The headline is Canada will sell weed for $7.77 a gram and will lose $544 million in the process.
I'm trying to. I think Uruguay has a fixed price on theirs as well.
So basically, they're just arguing that their goal is to hurt the black market, and they're going to try to undercut them and sell their weed for much cheaper, knowing that they're going to take a loss for a while, but they feel eventually they'll be profitable from it, and it'll all be worth it, which is an interesting approach. I mean, most of these cities claim they want to fight against the black market, but then they tax the shit out of you, which is counterproductive.
They don't understand how the black market works at all. They don't understand how difficult it is to go from the black market to the white market. And the taxes, the justification to their own citizens is they're greedy. It's going to solve everything. It's like this magical pile of cash that'll just keep falling.
And one of the things that's really hard to watch too is people are going to stay in the black market with the tax rates the way they are. Who can blame them? But where the governments are struggling to see is it's about the fact that they're bringing a boon to these cities in the form of jobs, in the form of spending at the supermarkets, in the form of buying products at the local Ace Hardware. All of these things that they're impacting on economies is actually really great for these cities and counties, and they're failing to see just purely jobs and regular sales tax revenue and all these basic economic fundamentals that these people are helping these cities with, as opposed to just a pure tax. And there's still sales tax, period, right? Anything that's going to go from a dispensary is still going to get the local sales tax, so it's still a new place to generate it from.
Do you ever see a future, maybe 10, 12 years down the line, where there is no more of this green sin tax on all this cannabis money, and it's just regular taxes for transaction and sales, and that's just it?
Highly doubt it. I think it's unlikely. I mean, even alcohol has higher taxes too. Cigarettes have higher taxes, and that's what people are trying to get taxed like. And this is one of those items I think will always have a, quote, sin tax, but I think it will become a much more reasonable one. I don't see it going away. I don't see there being an incentive for it to go all the way away. There's markets that are functioning well with it. Colorado functions, Nevada functions. And it's with tax.
Yeah, and
just the right tax.
What do you guys spend your taxes on in Colorado, though? What does it really go to? I heard some stuff about education.
There's a bunch of different things that were outlined when Prop 64 passed there. Same 64 as California, but different bills, very different bills. There's things like it's not like school teachers, it's school, like infrastructure of building schools is one of them. And there's a dozen different things it goes to. A chunk of it actually goes to cannabis research. They gave out, I believe, like $8 million a couple of years ago.
Are we talking real research or just like to say research so they can grow some crop there and sell it? Like they're actually doing
true
like double-blind
research,
studies?
like real medical research. So universities and people like Dr. Sue Sisley, who's doing the PTSD studies. I think she received $2 million of that. So they gave out $8 million for pure scientific research. There's a lot of different things it's going to, and the impacts are being felt. And what's interesting is the local governments are also really feeling it. So Pueblo, Colorado, and Pueblo County, they were an area that in southern Colorado that it was definitely not in its heyday. It was a steel town. And, all the steel has gone overseas for the most part. And so there's definitely some economic downturn down there. And what this has done down there has been phenomenal for them. They've created so much revenue, and they've also earmarked, though, in their ordinance that a certain percentage would go to a scholarship fund. And they have sent, and it's for students who will go to school in state at, I think, one of 2 universities. And they have sent, I think, probably over 50 kids to college now on it. And it's pretty cool, and they present these people with it, and they're really into it. And what's interesting is that there were some people in Pueblo County who wanted it back to the good old way, and so during the last election, they in the 2016 November election, they put a ballot measure to reverse everything that was happening and prohibit it in Pueblo. And it was interesting. We were at the Denver Marijuana Management Summit last fall, and it's a conference that's held mostly for government to learn from what Denver's doing and what each other is doing. And Sal Pace, who is a commissioner down there, he was not the least bit concerned about this measure passing, and it failed dramatically because the people of Pueblo do not want to go back to the time before this industry was there. It's been a boon, a huge boon.
What's the testing like in Colorado? Is there a lot of recalls and stuff like that happening, or is that not so much?
There are a lot of recalls, but they're not as prevalent as they were. I would love to know. I mean, I think testing is being done. There was the pesticides are usually the primary call. I actually only saw my first mold-related recall in the last 6 months. It's usually use of illegal pesticides, and I don't know how many the state's actually testing for, but I know when I compile the list, there's usually about 7 suspects that are the ones that are usually pinging hot, and that's, your ivermectin, imacloprid.
You guys have Eagle 20 problems there?
Spiromethicin,
or whatever it is.
Myclobutanol. Eagle 20 is a big one. Myclobutanol is a big one there. The spiromethicin. I mean, there's a bunch that are like the clear ones. And then what's interesting too, like one of the most painful recalls I saw, I felt so bad for this dispensary, and they're called The Farm, and they're a dispensary and a cultivator. And they got their tests back, like they were self-testing, and it came back hot. And it was for myclobutanol, I believe. And they're like, we don't use any products with myclobutanol. They read all their labels, and they're like, how is myclobutanol getting into this? So they then sent off every product they use in their facility to get it tested. And they found out that the Guardian Mite spray was not properly labeled. So Guardian had to actually deregistered itself as a pesticide in Colorado after that, because there's this list called the allowable list of pesticides. They were on the allowed list, but they hadn't properly labeled their bottles. So this company is trying to do everything they can to follow the rules. They find this out. They then go and tell the state, hey, Guardian has myclobutanol in it. We know because this, that, and that. Well, before they deregistered the Guardian Mite spray, they did a recall on The Farm. and they didn't give the farm any credit for like self-reporting for anything, and they were doing everything in their ability to make sure they were doing it right. And it was a really tough PR time for them, because they really were trying to do things right, and they didn't even get any credit for the whole finding out of the Guardian thing.
How big of a recall was it?
It was large. They destroyed a lot of cannabis, but it's more so about the reputational risk. And the thing is these recalls, generally what happens is it says, you can return your products from blah, blah, blah. And most, the consumers are never really finding out about these things or returning anything. It's who still has it on their shelves in their dispensary that hasn't sold it yet. Most of it's getting held up at the facilities and the inability to sell it. And to ultimately destroy it. So they take that financial loss, but it's the PR is what really can be quite challenging on them. And I mean, I've heard crazy things. There was one group that, before, so Eagle 20 used to be an allowed pesticide. There was nothing prohibiting it until a couple of years ago, when they realized, the carcinogenic effects when consumed. So there were some companies that had this one company had an older mom plant that used to get Eagle 20, but hasn't in ages. And, they clone her, and there's all this product. And basically, for some reason, the state came in and they decided to take a sampling from like the stem of the mom. And when they found Eagle 20, the ivermectin in it, or myclobutanol, they recalled every plant, every pound of everything that was taken from a cut from that mom, that was a lot. They did, however, eventually then go test all of those batches and saw that none of them had myclobutanol in them, and they did release them. But again, the PR on that is really tough. And how could you suspect they're going to come in and test your mom when that's not the product that the consumer is getting? And if you're trying to protect the consumer, why aren't you going to the product? It was just an interesting, but why? Because this isn't like examining a bank where they've been testing banks for 50 years. They're inventing it as they go. They don't know how to examine because there's no book on this. So can you blame them at the same time? They're still all trying to figure it out. They don't know how it goes. If it's in the genetics of the mom, is it going to get into the genetics of? There's just so little science behind all of this. So when I was at the Fed, I took one rule that was a 300-page rule, and I had 2-3 weeks off the road to turn it into a 2-page checklist for examiners to use. But I had a formula on how to do it. And we also went to training all the time. And even to become like a certified examiner, you had to do over 2 years of training. There's no one to certify these examiners in cannabis, because there's no such thing as an experienced one. And what it also happened to be a lot of in Colorado, the people doing these inspections were more like ex-cops, trying to do a little bit more of the catch people with their hand in the cookie jar, rather than doing examining based around what are the highest risks to human health and well-being. And so I'm sure we'll see a lot more evolution of that. And I think, honestly, California is pretty calculated in that and really cares about consumer safety. So I think we'll see more focus on that in their examining. But also be smart about stuff. Don't, I've seen violations for having the wrong time on your video surveillance. And it's like, guys, this is simple. Get the clock right on your video surveillance, right? When they're in there looking for stuff, don't give them the easies.
Yeah. Something so basic and simple that can be.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing that we always talking about pesticides is Monterey County. I think it's going to be a huge problem. There's going to be a lot of problems. We've talked about some of them before this podcast, but pesticides are going to be a massive problem for people here because of drift. If you're across the street from a strawberry field, or if you have one on your property, how do you prevent that pesticide from getting onto your plants when you're surrounded by ag? And you might even have a guy across the street who just had a plane come by and dust the crop. Like, what are you going to do to prevent that from getting on the plant and then getting a recall or having these problems? I think that's going to be a huge issue here.
It is. And I think what's interesting, I think it's going to be a big issue, but I think what is really cool is that I've been seeing a lot of really interesting technology in the works. And I keep hearing about new processes people are trying to patent, and it seems like they're really coming up with good tools out there to remediate pesticide contamination in a lot of this product. So that will be exciting. I think a lot of things, though, are definitely going to have to be extracted in order to deal around a lot of this stuff. But it is interesting because the thresholds are often much lower in cannabis than for anything else. And, they also normally come from the federal level. So back when Colorado asked the federal level, they asked the EPA for guidance on how they should evaluate this stuff. And their answer was, well, if it's being smoked, we would do it similar to how we would test tobacco. And if it's being eaten, to how we would test food. They gave them nothing, basically. And so everyone's also trying to figure this out. And, again, combustion of these pesticides and the risk of that versus, on your lettuce is extremely different and unknown.
Well, and tobacco is a tricky one to compare it to, right? Because tobacco, we already know it kills people. There's warnings on the box to say, hey, if you do this, shit might go bad for you. So, I don't know if it's the best thing to compare to, really, right? Like, we know it kills you, and people still do it anyway. So, how do you protect public safety in that regard? I don't know. But another thing that's when we're talking about what's going on in California, that's a big topic right now is the 1 acre caps. There was some talk about there being a 1 acre cap at the state level where nobody could grow bigger than 1 acre and stack their licenses to only up to 1 acre. California Growers is definitely leading the charge on wanting this cap to be reintroduced, which may be reintroduced in the final regs. Like you said, these are emergency regs, temporary regs. So that's something that in big counties, big ag counties like ours, obviously these guys wouldn't want to see that. We got to take Amanda to a couple different farms that are going through the permitting process here, and we'll, in a week or 2 weeks have to start getting those temporary licenses. And they certainly don't want to see those caps because all these farms are mega farms and they have huge resources and huge footprints on greenhouses. So do you think that's something that will ever happen, or is there any caps like that in Colorado or that you've seen anywhere?
There are no caps in Colorado. What they did was they created a production management rule where it basically said you can there was different tiered levels based on how much square footage you had, and you have to be able to sell 70% of everything you grew in the prior quarter in order to retain that, and you had to sell X percentage in order to tier up. So it was basically, the idea was to make sure there wasn't too much product out there. And it was more so about, trying to keep supply and demand more controlled. In this instance, the advocates yes, that's part of it, is about supply and demand, but their goal is to make sure that more small businesses can stay in business. It's a very different interest. Colorado went far more free market. There's the mega farms and there's the mom and pop, and free market forces dictated that. I think this will be an interesting one. I hear both sides of it. I think, a lot of people were shocked that 1 acre cap got lifted. I wasn't shocked, not because I expected it to get lifted, but think about it. Whose interests are the ones to remove it are the ones with bigger money and bigger farms, and big money tends to be able to dictate a whole lot of policy. So I wasn't surprised at all, and it will be interesting to see, and we'll see what happens as notice and comment rulemaking goes on in 2018. But I think you're going to see that there is a lot more people in support of the removal of said cap than what we think. I think a lot of people feel a little more shy speaking up in opposition to the cap because they're like, oh, I don't want people to hate me or think of me as like the big bully or the big guy who's trying to kick them out. Yeah, exactly. They're trying not to be the bad guy, the corporate sellout. But there's a lot more out there, I think, than are being vocal because they don't want to be the bad guy. So I think it'll be a much more torn debate than one might expect. I think right now people feel like a fastie got pulled on them from one guy or two guys. This was not one or two people that pushed for the removal of that. I'm sure it was a very sophisticated group.
Right.
And it will be an interesting to watch. There's going to be a lot of interesting stuff to watch in 2018.
Well, I mean, the question, too, is can we have cannabis regulation without big business taking over? I don't think we can. I
don't know the answer to that. I know that we have a really unique opportunity here in that this is federally illegal, because if it weren't federally illegal, the big guys would already all be here and this would be limited to very few people. So the fact that it's federally illegal has given these companies an opportunity to build their brands and build out their facilities in a way where they will have the ability to get acquired one day, or they'll become the big guy who does the acquiring. And that's just natural in any industry. And so, I mean, we're not going to start creating a new trend of economics like within this industry that's going to deviate from the rest of this country's, capitalistic society. I just don't think it's realistic. So yes, the big guys are going to emerge, but it's also about who ran their businesses better. You know, all these guys in Colorado who are doing the consolidating happen to have done it right early enough and made enough money and brought on the right investors, or didn't bring them on and bought the distressed assets and keep growing their brands bigger. Doesn't make them, impenetrable, because as we saw right before we got on this, we were reading an article that Sweet Leaf currently got all their Denver licenses suspended, and it didn't say why, but Sweet Leaf's a big guy. They're a big one. They have maybe north of 10 to 15 dispensaries, multiple grow operations. They're on that scale the way you would think of a Harborside, a Caliva, one of these big guys. They're at that level, and they just got in trouble too. So nobody is untouchable. Nobody.
Yeah, you would even think they would want to make examples out of those big guys too. They might get more scrutiny than other farms.
They do. They get much, much bigger fines, and they definitely, people get in trouble at those. They just pay the fines and keep moving forward, and they try to do anything but what might get a license revoked.
Right.
And it's not because they want to be bad. It's and be like, or they're disregarding the rules. It's that when you have a entity that large, you could have a bad rogue employee. When there's 300 and one rogue employee can cause you a lot of problems, and they're watching you much closer when you're one of the big guys. So it can be really hard to control everything as you are one of the big ones. But also they're going to come at you because they know everyone else is watching.
So you touched on it a little bit before my last question. We're getting towards the end. I wanted to ask you, what do you predict for 2018? What do you think this is going to look like? I mean, what do you think is going to happen?
A lot of confusion, a lot of chaos, and a tax crisis.
Yeah.
I really think taxes are going to really come to a head, and maybe not in the first part of 2018, but I think in the second half, there's going to be a realization that the taxes are insurmountable in a lot of these local jurisdictions. And I think there's going to be a lot of changes of tax rates. And in some places, it's going to require a vote, even because the minimum threshold that's set, even if they were given a range on where to set it to, could be too high as well. So I think that's going to be a lot. I think you're going to see a lot of people go out of business, and it's going to be hard to watch, but there's a lot of people right now that are not prepared and have no idea what they're about to face. And I would love to be able to help them all and protect them all, but I can't. It's natural. It happens. There's going to be a lot of people are going to go out of business. There's going to be a lot of acquisitions. Some larger players are going to rise in their size because they're going to be prepared to acquire. And then we're going to have a tax crisis too.
And Ryan, I'm curious what you think, because this could very well be our last podcast before the new year. So what are your thoughts on 2018?
We named the show for a reason, right? $1 pound show. So I think taxes is going to be an absolute disaster. I think all the counties are just going to play musical chairs. I got to ask you this question, though. You're out here so much. When do you plan to move out here, and what county or city you want to move to? Because there's so much action all over the state. LA is like Mecca, but the center's got a lot of cool stuff. And
I have actually given myself an artificial deadline to make the move. Everyone assumes I live here. I'm here more than 50%. I'm passionate about California, so I am going to move in the next 4 months, and I'm going to go to the Bay.
Not bad.
I mean, there was a lot to consider, right? LA.
SF side or Oakland?
That's up in the air. I think I'm going to go SF because I really want to be personally not just in tune with the cannabis scene, but with the tech scene. And I think if I end up in the East Bay, I'll just hang out with all the different cannabis friends I have already, which they're awesome, and I still will regardless. But I would like to experience San Francisco. And then, there's that debate of, do you go Bay or do you go LA? I much rather live in the Bay, just personally, even though LA has more business. And from the Bay, I can easily take the quick jaunt up to Sacramento, which I find myself in at least twice a quarter at this point. So I am Bay Area bound. Nice. I have not made that official on Facebook or anywhere yet. You just got it out of me on,
it's exclusive,
on record,
guys.
though.
We're going to throw you a hell of a house party, I'll tell you that.
Woohoo! And you're going to see a lot more of me down here now that I've finally experienced the beautiful Central Coast.
Oh,
you're
yeah.
You're going to be asking me to leave a bit. Enough. Go back. Get out.
No, honestly, you'll tell us, like, you know what? I went to SF, but I wish I just moved here. It's so much nicer. So much more beautiful. Look at it's like summer outside right now, and it's like winter. So
it's beautiful. I love it down here. I need a little more action.
There's not much action down here.
We shall see.
Well, let's just finish off by, we got to plug CannaRegs.com. I mean, it's something that Ryan and I use on a regular basis. Anybody that's a compliance nerd or, that just wants to figure out what's going on in certain areas, that's the thing to use.
The best tool ever.
Ryan and I were talking with Amanda at lunch that we were trying to create our little rinky-dinky spreadsheet when this was all coming together. And she made the point, like, yeah, you would have finished your spreadsheet. It would have been outdated anyway. Yeah. So CannaRegs is a huge tool for anybody that's taking this serious and wants to keep up with what's happening. I definitely enjoy the tool you guys have with your calendar where I can see what's coming up, because that's something we could have used 2 years ago, big time in this county. I mean, it was hard enough to keep up with a county, let alone the whole country that you guys are doing. So
Yep. California has kept us really busy. I mean, I was joking earlier that this week was a slow week. We only tracked, I think, 80 cities in California, cities and counties meeting this week. But
yeah,
the more recent weeks have been more like 120 a week meeting, not just meeting, but meeting on cannabis-specific agenda items. So we have our hands full, and we're definitely getting really in-depth with the state stuff. So instead of people, spending their days researching, we definitely like that you guys can do your jobs, which is the analysis and the compliance in your cannabis business without spending your day researching. We put the facts right in front of you, and glad you guys like it.
Yeah, no, it's great. Someone asked me today, hey, I'm thinking about doing something in Grover Beach, and I was on the phone with them. I was like, oh, really? Boom, clicked it up, and I was like, oh, well, actually, you got to do this, that, this zone. They're like, how do you know all that? I was like, I have my ways.
You say magic.
Everyone likes to keep it a secret from each other.
Right.
And I'm like, no, tell your friends. Tell your friends. And they're like, but it's my little special tool.
Yeah, then I don't look as cool.
Do you have any idea? All those billable hours for lawyers just gone out the window, so you're saving us so much money and time, so thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else you wanted to plug or talk about before we kind of wrap this up?
No, just check out CannaRegs.com, and we're all over the state. Reach out. Look forward to meeting more people and making the move out here full time.
Awesome. I appreciate the time, Amanda, and until next time, unless you got anything, Ryan, I think that's about it.
It's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, this was awesome. Everyone, if we don't hear from you, or you don't hear from us by the time this year's over, enjoy that black market weed, because I don't know what next year's going to look like. But until next time, smoke them if you got them. We'll talk to you guys later.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the $1 Pound Podcast with your hosts, Ryan and Joey, online at $1pound.com. We'll catch you next time.